You got me now? So that's the great thing about being live. You know, we're live right now. We got people watching at home and all over everywhere, listening to the service, and you have mistakes now and then. That's great. What I was going to say when I walked up was I'm really grateful to Cheryl and Curtis for sharing their story with us. At the beginning of this whole experience, when we all became quarantined, they were going through a difficult moment with Cheryl's dad, who was at the end stages of his life. And it's so refreshing and so wonderful to hear how the church was a family, became family to Curtis and Cheryl. And what I want to share with you is, she said there was an opportunity in the moment. Here was the opportunity. We weren't filming any services at that moment. And you as a congregation generously invested in making all this possible, live streaming, filming. And as a result, it made the ending of her dad's life very peaceful and very meaningful as they were able to reconnect on a spiritual family. And let's just point out right now, we don't have the number of people that normally be in this room. But now listening to the sound of my voice are people all over everywhere, from Kentucky to Indiana to different parts of the United States and here in Louisville. We are one church family together. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that great news? Isn't God good? Isn't God good? So are you ready for some words? I got a word for you. I'm going to be preaching today from Mark chapter 2. When he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many gathered around that there was no longer room for them, not even in the front door. And he was speaking the word to them. Then some people came bringing to him a paralyzed man carried by 4 of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him. And after having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some of the scribes were sitting there, questioning in their hearts, "Why does this fellow speak in this way? It is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" At once Jesus perceived in his spirit they were discussing these questions among themselves, and he said to them, "Why do you raise such questions in your hearts? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up, take your mat, and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, stand up, take your mat, and go to your home." And he stood up immediately, took his mat, and went out before all of them, and they were all amazed, and they all glorified God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." Let me repeat that last phrase. We have never seen anything like this. Well, that last statement probably is really an understatement. I mean, just imagine the scene in your mind, if you will. It's Capernaum. Capernaum is the home base for Jesus' base of operation near and around the Sea of Galilee, where he did most of his miracles and his teachings and his healings. There's a home there probably belonging to Simon Peter and Simon Peter's family, and it is packed full of people. People have come from far and wide to bring the sick and the diseased and to listen and to hear Jesus preach and teach, eager to hear his message. Inside the room also were scribes and Pharisees who were trying to determine, who is this man who heals the sick and drives out demons? Meanwhile, late to the party were 4 men carrying a paralytic on a pallet by each end of the stretcher. But by the time they got to the room, to the home, it was crowded full of people. They pushed and prodded and tried to get the man in. They perhaps walked around the building to see if there's a window where they might enter, but there was no space. Now imagine in your mind, if you will, they look back, the crowd looks back at the doors, they see them trying to get in the building, and they make eye contact with the man lying on the mat. And they can see his desperation. And they make eye contact with the 4 friends who are just exasperated and exhausted and frustrated that they can't get their friend to Jesus. But what do? After making eye contact, they just turned around to look at Jesus without making any effort to make room for the man. Now I like to imagine what happened. These are 4 guys, and they're probably outside talking among them, saying, what are we going to do? How are we going to get them to Jesus? And one of them says, well, did you see if there were any security cameras on the building? No, I didn't see any security cameras. What do you got in mind? Well, let's get up on the roof. What good's that going to do, you genius? The roof, he's inside. We're outside. What good is that going to do? He said, let's just go up on the roof. And that day, a roof was a flat, hard surface that would be like a deck on the back of your house where people could stand or sleep in the cool of the night, made of hard mud packed over beams and sticks and branches. What good's that going to do, you genius, they said. Well, we're going to tear the roof off. That's what we're going to do. And so can you imagine these 4 guys struggling carrying each end of the pallet up onto the roof, worried that they're going to drop their friend off the mat or off the roof and to the ground. Now inside you can imagine they're hearing footsteps on top of the roof, wondering what's happening. And then the noise gets louder as they can start to hear the digging. And they're trying hard to listen to Jesus until dirt starts to fall from the roof. Small clumps, little dirt, and then more dirt when a big chunk of dirt hits Jesus right on the head. At this point, Jesus looks up. Now, have you ever been distracted trying to listen to a sermon? This wasn't no baby in the room. These are guys digging a hole in the roof. At this time, Jesus has totally lost control or the attention of the crowd. And everybody's looking up as more dirt falls, then a little opening, and then a big opening, and then an even bigger opening. Imagine the opening through the roof had to be big enough to lay a full-grown man down by ropes to the floor. So they're looking up. They see 4 guys covered in dirt and sweat. They see a paralyzed man lying on a mat, lowering slowly down to the floor, who comes to rest straight in front of Jesus. And Jesus looks up, and you see these 4 men smiling. He looks around, he sees the crowd. Can you imagine what expression was on their face? And then Mark says there was not a single word spoken because everyone was waiting to see what would Jesus do. Now, when you look in the text, Mark makes an editorial comment. He makes this editorial comment why Jesus acted in the story, why Jesus forgave his sins. Mark says that when he saw the faith of this man's friends, not the faith of the man on the floor, he didn't ask the man to make a confession of faith. The man doesn't speak at all. But when he saw the faith of the 4 friends who were determined enough to dig a hole through the roof, it was at that moment that he spoke. Now, I just want to describe what is faith. When Jesus saw faith, what did he see? Faith is not a belief, it's not a feeling, it's something we do. It's putting our beliefs into action. It looks like 4 guys carrying a man to Jesus, carrying him on the roof, and digging a hole through the roof. Faith acts on its belief and takes action and does. And because of their faith, Jesus speaks a powerful word. Now, you might have missed it because we overlooked this word. But you know what's the most beautiful word in the whole story? The first word spoken in the text is Jesus looks at the man and says, son. Not paralytic, not burdened, not charity case, not outcast, not sinner, because in those days they equated and intertwined sin and sickness together, which would force people to live outside the community. His whole life he lived with the stigma of his paralysis as if something was wrong with him and that he was a disappointment to God. But here in the presence of Jesus, the first word spoken, he restores the man's dignity by saying, son, you belong here. You are welcome here. You are loved. You are my child. Wow. What great words. Now I want to flip the story a little bit. And what I want to do is I want to put you in the story. I want you to imagine for a moment that you're the man lying on the mat. Because we've all been laid down by something. I don't know what it is for you, but we've all had those moments when we couldn't get up. We've all had those moments when we couldn't carry ourselves. It could have been a divorce. It could have been depression. It could have been a sickness. It could have been an illness. It could have been a job loss. Any number of things. But we've all had those moments in our lives when we couldn't carry ourselves. You're lying there on the mat, and I want you to look up through the hole in the ceiling, and I want you to see the faces, those 4 faces staring down. Let me ask you, when you look up, whose faces do you see? Who has carried you when you couldn't carry yourself? Who had faith when maybe you had no faith? Now let me put you in another place. It's a great question. Let me put you on the roof looking down. You're looking through the hole and you're looking at someone lying on the floor. Who is it that's on the floor? Who have you carried? Instead of saying, who have you carried, let me ask you, who do you need to carry? Who around you right now can't carry themselves? Who around you right now needs hope? Who around you right now needs to be called son or daughter? Who around you feels disconnected, estranged, lost, or afraid? When you look down and you look at that mat, who do you need to carry to Jesus? I thought about that this week. I thought about who do I see above and who do I see below. And this is the one person that came to mind. His name is Tom Schifano. Tom Schifano and I met 17 years ago during a family tragedy in his family. Tom was a very unusual friend. You wouldn't necessarily put the two of us together. Tom was a very successful businessman in the Louisville area, and he was a real character. He was one of those guys walking the room, and you knew Tom Schifano was in the room. He was an Italian Catholic from New Jersey who loved Bruce Springsteen. I show you this picture because he's wearing on his shirt, his jacket there, a pin. It says International Racing Commissioner. He made it up. He wasn't a commissioner. There's no such thing. But Tom made that pin up because he loved the Kentucky Derby, and Tom, 4 years in a row, was able to make his way all the way to the winner's circle using that pin by faking it all the way down to the front. Imagine the biggest sporting event in the world, watched by millions, and if you look, you'll see a guy there in a pinkish jacket standing down there on winner's circle. He's actually got one where he's standing next to the horse with the roses laid over the horse. He was one of those guys. But Tom also had a drinking problem. And one day Tom called me and he said, I need to talk. And Tom met me for lunch. And he laid his heart out before me. He had lost his job. And Tom was at the bottom. It's a longer story than that, but the story ends happily that Tom began his path to sobriety after that conversation, through the support of his family and his friends and through the 12-step program. Tom and I then started a Bible study afterwards, and for 3-4 years we met with guys who struggled with addictions, and we read the Bible together, and Tom and I read the Bible together, and I watched Tom stand up and walk. That's who I see. But when I look up, you know who I also see? I see Tom looking down at me, because as I carried Tom, Tom carried me. When I was diagnosed with lymphoma, one of the first people I called was Tom. I said, Tom, I need to come see you. And I went over to see Tom and his wife, Wendy, and told them what was happening. And Tom looked at me, and I'll never forget his words. I was scared, and Tom looked at me and said, we'll get through this. And through my 6 months of radiation and chemo, Tom was there for me, supporting me. And on the day when the doctor came and said, you've got a good report, you're clean, the cancer's gone, Tom was there and drove me home from the hospital. Friends, that's what church is at its best. What is church as its best? It's a family. It's when we carry each other, because there are all moments in our life when we can't carry ourselves to Christ, but others carry us. And other moments when they can't get themselves to Christ, and we carry them. Strip away the liturgy, take away our comfortable pews and chairs, take out these candles, take away the music, take away the sermons, take away the Bible studies, take away our beautiful buildings, get rid of the stained glass. Ultimately, what is the church? The church, we are people. We are people who carry one another to Christ. We thrive together as we carry each other to Christ. Let me make 4 points. 1, none of this happens without Jesus. Otherwise, it would just be a social club, a society of friends. But the healing and the forgiveness and the grace takes place because they brought him to Jesus. Not to some club, but to Jesus. The second thing is I'd point out to you that this story concerns the whole person. Jesus is concerned about our whole life. He restores the man's dignity by calling him son. He forgives the man's sins. And in this story, the main point of the story is not the physical healing, but the spiritual healing. He declares to the man, there is no longer a separation between you and God. You are forgiven. He addresses the man's spiritual condition. That's the primary reason he tells the story, because in the story, it says that the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins. And then he heals his physical body. And because of all that, the word used there is the word rise up, which is the word for resurrection. In the resurrection story, he rises up and he walks out of the room healed in soul, mind, body, and spirit. The third thing is, notice, Jesus is in the middle of everything. He's not up above, directing things from up above like this. He's right there in the middle of it, in the middle of all those religious people and all those people that need to be healed. He's in the middle of the dirt and all the mess. He's right in all of it. And right now in our world, there's so much tension and struggle and so much urgent spiritual and physical needs. And whereas Jesus in the middle of it, and that's why we cannot forget our call to be stretcher barriers, to meet people where they are and to meet their physical and spiritual needs by carrying them to Christ. And sometimes, the church, we get spiritual amnesia. Sometimes the church, instead of being a community of stretcher barriers, we become a community of comfort. It's all about what I want, where I sit, my music, my programs, my life. This is my chair. And we don't look back at the world, we just look facing forward. Sometimes we become a community of complaint. By the way, Jesus didn't have ESP when he was looking at the crowd to know that they were angry with him, because anybody that's ever preached the gospel or stood in a church or was a public speaker, you know right away he's not in agreement. You can tell. And the final thing is, I would say to you in this story is, the final and the most beautiful thing is that when the church is willing to get wrecked, great things happen. Now, let me say what I mean. Well, we got plenty of room. Yeah, we got room in our building, but churches everywhere crowd people out in different ways. We crowd people out by our unfriendliness, our exclusiveness, by our theology, by our traditions. People will say, hey, Sunday morning is the most racially segregated hour of the week. We want to be a church open to all people. We want to be a diverse church. But then why are we not more diverse? Because we're not willing to adjust our worship styles, because it's more important to worship the way we want than it is to welcome people in a style that may welcome and embrace them. Because it's, my music. It's my thing. We're called to be stretcher bearers, not a culture of complaint or comfort. So at the end of the story this week, I got a call from Tom's wife, And she asked me if I would be on a Facebook Live call with them because we were going to do this. Tom died a year ago. Tom died a year ago after a 4-year struggle with pancreatic cancer. And these are the people who walked with him, that carried him over those 4 years. His family, his son, his wife, his entire family. And over 4 years, I saw Tom, even though Tom had cancer over the last 4 years, he continued to carry people in the AA program, continued to carry people in the business community, continued to get up and go to work as long as he could, continued to carry his family, and continued to carry others who were in the cancer community. Then on that day when Tom could no longer carry himself, his family, our church, we carried him on his mat to the altar to be in the presence of Jesus. And the room was filled from front to back because of the way he carried others. And then afterwards, we carried him out. We put him in a hearse. And as he was put in a hearse, I yelled for someone to start the music, and we played Born to Run by Springsteen. He was carried off in the hearse. And then we got him to the iconic Cave Hill Cemetery, and we laid Tom Schifano in his grave. And at that moment, when we could no longer carry him, the one who carried Tom's sins in his body and has carried ours and our burdens, carried Tom home. Will you pray with me? Gracious God, we are reminded today on this All Saints Sunday of those that have carried us and those we have carried. We think about all those people who have carried us, those 4 friends looking down at us, and we're so thankful for their love and grace. And help us to be more mindful of the needs, the urgent physical and spiritual needs around us, that we too might carry others to Christ. We thank you for the healing power of forgiveness and grace that we have in Jesus Christ. Amen.